first, just by way of introduction, you know, there are a number of unindicted co-conspirators in this talk. And as I was preparing these slides, I just started writing out a bunch of people whose work I've benefited from, and I then thought, oh, I better kind of be a little transparent about who all these people are. So I indicated some co-authors, and then I thought, oh, the most important relationships, of course, have been with my students, and so I put some extra 2 stars for the students, and then I realized I'm I need to the most important thing are maybe the people I'm missing. So this is not in any way exhaustive. This is just the people who I recommend, who off the top of my head this morning, I recommend you go look at their work. And I know I'm missing people. And in fact, as soon as I logged on, the first person I saw was Anders Krabbe. And I thought, oh, the first person I've forgotten. Anders, hello. People should read your work. It's super helpful. You and your co-authors are, you know, I think uh, traveling parallel paths here, coming from different directions, but I think very much part of this conversation of thinking about how we use history. So I'm sure there are others. I haven't been able to go through the whole list of attendees. So this is not exhaustive. These are just, to be clear, my thoughts about our topic today at this time. So um, I was going to start. I went back. I've been giving talks like this for about 25 years, and I realized um, so I went back and sort of looked at some of my more recent slide decks, and I found this slide from about 2020 where it was talking about the historic turn in management studies. And I looked, there were some special issues of journals and some books, some important sort of gathering places. Um, and uh, I was going to start updating it, and I realized, wait a minute, this is actually a historic artifact. This slide, in some sense, and uh, it, it it captures sort of my thinking. And I thought, oh, this is probably about 2020. And then I said, oh, well, let me go back. And I found a slide from about 2013 that talked about what history is and what history is not. And I think it's interesting. History is not a sandbox for testing theory. History is not narrative in management academia. History is not qualitative methods by another name. I've been calling that YAQUM, YAQUM, yet another qualitative method. And it's certainly not a teaching tool. It's all of those things, but we should be thinking about historical methods. And I thought, oh, well, I was saying that 10 years ago. And so then I kind of kept going at looking at some of these older slide decks, and I found one actually from 2007 where I was using it to give an example of how historical knowledge works, how we generate historical knowledge claims. And this was a picture of I gave this example. I'll run through it pretty quickly. And when I did it in 2007, I made a big deal of it. But this is a fellow student of mine in my PhD cohort in history at Stanford who was a very well-trained uh, and highly qualified historian. He came to the PhD in the 90s with a, a class valedictorian from Williams College and a triple major in Russian and poli-sci math. And he started writing about the use of the veil in Uzbekistan in 1927. That's where he started his work. He was interested in the tension between uh, the sort of role of gender and religion in the consolidation of the Soviet Empire. And so I kind of played it out like this, and he ended up writing a book called Veiled Empire that won a prize in its field for the this veiled empire, gender and power in Stalinist Central Asia. And I used this case to sort of illustrate how knowledge claims in history have generally worked. You build upon these very narrow, detailed studies. So right down here is Uzbekistan in 1927, and up here is gender and empire in Stalinist Central Asia. And we kind of this is kind of the general way that historians have worked. And so this was the story I told. And I said, look, this is something we have to be able to live with in management, is that this is the way historical claims work. And um, you know, uh, I think what I'd like to do today is actually ask, can we move past this framing from 2007, 2013, even 2020, and ask sort of uh, we've turned, the historic turn is done. So now where are we? And what can we do? And how do we think about historical methods in the field of organization studies at this time? And so that's kind of what I'd like to do uh, with this talk. So a couple of questions, sort of where do historical methods fit into our thinking of and our practice of management science or management research? So um, is it the case that there are historical methods kind of in on the side, separate from, say, sociological methods and economic methods? Or do we actually want to think about historical methods as kind of cutting across a lot of our methodological toolkits and thinking that, well, actually, we need historical methods in sociology, we need historical methods in economics, in social psychology, because of the problems that we've identified with the way those fields produce knowledge claims. And so, I'm going to suggest my view on this is that historical methods are cross-cutting, that they apply in many different that we need historical methods to answer lots of questions in management research, but um, I'm, some of those unindicted co-conspirators who I listed earlier have a different view of that on that question, and I think one can reasonably argue that, well, no, history stands apart. History does its own thing. Historical methods answer their own questions, and that's where the historical method is best deployed. We That's a topic we can come back to. The second question I would way I would or the second sort of path forward, if you will, is, and again, this is very much from my point of view, because I think the historical methods do have consequences for the other methods that we use. And so we need to think about how historical methods constrain or enable or help or hinder our other modes of knowing. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, and I'll get into that. But again, that's part of my view, is that this historical methods are cross-cutting, and we need to think about them in that way. And then finally, perhaps most consequentially, I think we need to really take seriously the way that historical methods may transform what we call management knowledge or our knowledge claims. And here, I'm going to just draw upon uh, some very recent work that I've been doing. But I think this is really for me the heart of my contribution is what I've called this audacious plea for humble claims. So the idea here is, and I'll walk through this in a little bit of detail because I've thought about it, and if those of you who may have been at some of the sessions that I was presenting at the Academy, this may look familiar. So this is, in that sense, a recycled slide. So I put 2024 on it. Uh, but uh, let's just think a little bit about what I'm saying here. So for a lot of management science, there is this crisis of replicability. So what it means in effect is that a lot of studies are being published with unreliable statistical analyses, where the correlations are true, but we can't, the correlations are real, but we can't infer what the t-stat means or the the p-value. So unless we can pre-specify our analyses without peeking at the data and with high precision, our test statistics are unreliable. That's a way of framing the replication crisis in social science. And this part, I think, is critically important. This problem is particularly important in applied fields like management. It may not be that big a deal for the economists or people writing formal models, uh, but when in our applied fields where we have to peek at the data because what we do is by is collect data. We're peeking at it. And then it's very hard to pre-register or to come up with hypotheses. It's, you know, if you pick a typical uh, empirical paper in uh, um, in org studies, it's going to be very hard to have imagined, oh, I could have looked at exactly and pre-specified exactly what that regression was going to be with all the possible covariates in advance. So we know this, and yet we still write papers with hypotheses. I haven't written a hypothesis paper in a few years, but I wrote a few of them. I'm not especially proud of them. Uh, and there may be good reasons why we work with hypotheses, but in most instances, I will suggest, and certainly when I review papers at this point, I say, where's your pre-specification plan? Why should we believe that this is a hypothesis that you generated in prior to coming to this data set, um, rather than something that you discovered in the course of interacting with the data that you have then hypothesized after the results were known, the idea of harking. So it's a testimony problem. If we want to honestly and transparently, and for those of you who are familiar with the testimony literature, you could think of this as competent and sincere. If we want to sincerely and competently report our own research, we need to embrace a more explanation-focused approach. Not every paper, but many papers. And that explanation-focused approach is, what we are calling abduction. It's the way to seek explanations. So when we do that, we seek puzzles, we generate explanations, and then evaluate them according to a set of explanatory virtues that we can discuss. But this is hard. It's harder to do than simply um, generating a set of hypotheses, testing them, and then calling the results of those tests contributions to theory. So here's, again, where it gets really sticky is it means that the structure and content of our knowledge claims are have to change. And this places new burdens on us as scholars, readers, and editors. And so it's the only way forward. So this is why I say proceed with humility. So this is kind of the outline for my view of kind of where we are. And let me see, I see there's a question. So let me just maybe take a peek at the question. History is often written by the victor. Ravi, it's a really interesting question. We have there's yeah, there's certainly survival bias in our, or history is written by the winners, et cetera. I think one of my co-conspirators, uh, Stephanie Decker, has a marvelous paper on the silence of the archives that I would recommend, which really talks about how certain voices fail to be, are not represented. And I think, the field of history has been doing a much better job over the last 3 or 4 decades in my lifetime at trying to excavate those voices and listen to the the voices that were missing from the archive. But maybe in management, we may need to still do a better job of that. Most strategy is the from the view of the C-suite, and maybe we need to be thinking more about the full range of participants. So it's um, a good question. Um, okay, if there are any other questions about this sort of summary of the argument, I'll proceed. Where are we? Whoop. Yeah, so abduction. I'll just say a little bit about it for those of you who may have access to Apple TV. This is from the Ted Lasso show. It's everywhere, and so what is it? How do we use it? We have, and again, this is some ongoing collaboration with colleagues in my department and former students and others. We're trying to come up with a little bit of a template, but we're trying not to call it a template because the last thing we want is just a new template to replace the old template. But I think the idea of we get asked a lot, I get asked a lot, sort of how should I do, how do I practice abduction? And so we have this sort of acronym PEBI. You start with a puzzle, you try and generate explanations, you choose the best explanation, and you interpret your analysis for others. So this is kind of the summary approach. We have a working paper on this. I'm happy to share it with people. It's right now a little bit in tatters, but it's due back to the journal later in the fall. So I will have something for you. And this is really building on the fundamental work of philosophers of science, people like Peter Lipton and Igor Duvin. I will say Duvin's book, if you're interested, is from MIT Press. The first couple chapters are just a beautiful summary of the logic of abduction. And at least last when I checked, that book is available in uh, open source format from the MIT Press. So we we balance in this view ideas, explanations that are more or less lovely with those that are more or less likely. So likeliness is sort of how close do we believe they are to what may have actually happened, the thing that the past, the set of events, and loveliness is the ability of that explanation to generate meaning for us. So if an explanation that's very, very likely, but not very interesting, I can't take it anywhere. I can't apply it. It doesn't travel. It's not transferable to other contexts. It will have relatively less value and have lower loveliness. So it might explain this particular context, but knowing that context may not help me to understand other contexts. And so we evaluate explanations using judgment, and that judgment is based on a set of explanatory virtues, consilience, which is sort of how close does this explanation come to the facts as we understand them? Coherence, how much does this explanation align with prior theory? And precision is the idea of how closely does this explanation map to the particular instance in which we are applying it. Parsimony, we think of as sort of um, how simple is this explanation? It's sort of, if you think of Occam's razor, that simplest explanation has, how many assumptions do we have to make for this explanation to work in this case? Um, if we have to do a lot of work to get that explanation to apply, then maybe we're giving up some parsimony. And kind of the related to parsimony is this idea of generalizability. So is this a general explanation? Sometimes you might think of it as how close does this explanation get us to theory? And where else could we take this? And, so the ideal explanation is one that is both lovely and likely, but in practice, these explanations don't come, we can't choose them in that way. They just, explanations have these different features. We experience them and evaluate them and choose among them. So the explanation, the sample I have two examples. I think I used actually both of them at various times at the Academy. But because this is the group on historical methods, I'm going to use a historical example. And that this example, I will also say, was actually in the first version of the Lovely and Likely paper that we submitted to the journal. And it took too many pages of real estate in the article, in the manuscript. So they said, no, come up with something simpler. But I think in this context, it's very good because this is one where you may really have heard this is one that, it's a real puzzle. So the the prediction was made by Thomas Watson, that, or people reported it. If you go to Google and search for, seven worst predictions of all time, you'll get Tom Watson, the CEO of IBM, saying, I think there's a world market for maybe 5 computers. And you sort of say to yourself, that's just so crazy. How can that be? What was going on there? And so we actually went back and looked at the context, the history of that statement to try and understand, well, what was going on? And how should we understand, how should we explain that prediction? And, you know, so what's the puzzle? What makes this failed prediction interesting? What makes it interesting is, haha, there's a market for millions of computers. Why would the guy who was making this first commercial product, believe that there was only a market for 5? Aren't we so much smarter than Tom Watson? Or isn't the, it's sort of a, wow, the world is hard to predict. So there's it kind of that that's interesting. We're curious about that. Um, so here's a little bit of the context. This the statement was made at a shareholder meeting, an IBM shareholder meeting. And if we read it, IBM had developed a paper plan for, and this is the machine that he was selling, and took this paper plan across the country to some 20 concerns that we thought could use such a machine. I would like to tell you that the machine rents for between $12,000 and $18,000 a month. So this is, in the uh, 1950 time frame. So you can imagine that's quite a bit more now. So it was not the type of thing that could be sold from place to place. But as a result of our trip, on which we expected to get orders for 5 machines, we came home with orders for 18. So that's where the statement, the five worst, 7 worst tech predictions comes from. We expected to get orders for 5 machines. But when we look at it, it actually is a much more complicated context. Where is he? He's talking to his shareholders. He's actually, managing their expectations, saying, "Oh, we thought we'd only get 5, but in fact we got 18." So we had 3 times as many orders for this machine as we thought we would. So it's actually a very kind of optimistic and, oh, there's growth in this market, and we think there's something here. We'd like to do more. So again, we immediately see that this explanation, the that was a terrible prediction, is not probably, it's too lovely and not very likely. So if we start digging in, we say, oh, this is the machine he was sending his salespeople around to sell. This gigantic thing that took up half a room and needed an air conditioner and trained technicians and had to come with its own little desk chair. I mean, this is an enormous investment, and hardly looks like, the so you know when you say that Tom Watson made a prediction of a worldwide demand for 5 computers, we sort of think of this. We think of the laptop. We think of our contemporary definition of a computer, but it was this. So it was obviously a very different artifact that he was selling, and and it was actually, 18 concerns, not 5, who were interested in paying that very high price to get it. So let's generate a list of explanations. So explanation 1, Tom Watson is a dummy. There was a world market for 5 computers. Explanation 2, Watson's team underestimated demand for the IBM 701. That's, I think, quite clearly true. Explanation 3 might be he was trying to impress his shareholders in some way. Uh, we thought, look how great demand for our product is. And maybe explanation 4, he's manipulating the shareholders to actually generate support for a cheaper follow-on product that has yet to be released. And so if we kind of look at if we generate a explanation table, and this is kind of the the craft tool that we use for doing this kind of uh, lovely and likely analysis, we can map each explanation and evaluate how each explanation holds up according to our explanatory virtues. So if we look at our observation, we have a set of observations, we have some prior theory, and you can see that the foolish explanation really doesn't hold, is not conciliant with the facts we observe. It's very parsimonious, but it doesn't generate a lot of depth or insight. And it's only, sort of partially coherent. All it's sort of saying is, the future is uncertain. Whereas if we go down to, say, explanation 4, we could say, oh, well, this explanation is conciliant with all of the observations that we adduce. It's coherent with the idea that CEOs are strategic actors and that the future is uncertain. And it offers a reasonable degree of depth because it actually allows us to understand what was going on in that moment, how a strategic actor might, like a CEO, might need to generate support for a complex uh, path for development, an uncertain development path. So if we map those explanations, and I think I may have swapped my axes. I think Lovely was on the x-axis earlier, which so I apologize for that. But we could see sort of foolish. The explanation one is super lovely, but really not very likely. These, you know, explanations two and three are sort of somewhere in the middle, and explanation four really has some loveliness and some likeliness. It generates meaning for our understanding of how organizations work, and it is also consilient and coherent with our prior theory and the facts that we observe in this case. And so our preferred explanation in this case would be E4. We sort of circle E4 and say that's what we think was really going on in this case. So um, let me just stop there for a minute and see if there are any. Well, here actually I'll just kind of to wrap up on kind of how we use these abductive methods, how we use historical methods conducting um, when we're doing abductive research. Oh, I do see a couple questions. So, Jiling says, how to do observation for this case? Watson is not there anymore. That's correct. So what we need to do is look for as many contemporaneous accounts as possible of what was going on. And, you know, there were minutes of that shareholder meeting. There were uh, historical accounts written in, say, the annals of the history of computing about this. There's been an ongoing debate about what that where did that sort of expert misprediction come from? Um, and a lot of the historians who were involved in that were just arguing about what happened. But of course, as management researchers, we want to understand why the thing that happened matters and how we learn from it. And so that's where our judgments of lovely and likely might be different from the judgments that a different scholar with a different set of interests might raise. So, Jile, I hope that's answers that. And then let's see, Ravi asks, which historical knowledge remains relevant, which does not? How can we effectively identify and discard outdated information to avoid wasting resources on rediscovering the path? Yeah, so that's kind of the opposite of the sandbox problem, right? It's not that we go back to the past and find something and use it. It's not presentism. It's sort of just yet another historical story. And we don't have great ways of inoculating ourselves against that because we don't know what we will find. We don't know what we don't know. And so I think we can have some judgment. We can listen to someone describe a historical case and say, oh, I think that might be an instance of this interesting contemporary theoretical problem. But when we do the work, we might discover it was something different. So this is, I think, every mode of knowledge production comes with some trade-offs, and this is one of history's trade-offs. Historical methods do, um, require us to be patient, and they're not efficient in that sense. Okay, let's see, Brett.
David, can
Yeah,
I ask a
please.
question?
Please.
So if you have, since you have the sort of, two axes
Mhm.
of lovely and likely, are you trying to, do you have the kind of the sweet spot on that one? But also, if there's a tension between lovely and likely, where would you tilt towards? Would be more preferred from a research scholarship point of view?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I don't have, I think this is a judgment question, and every person will make their judgment based on what they are trying to explain, what is of most interest. And so I think for management research, uh, an explanation that doesn't have some loveliness, that can't generalize a little bit, that can't reach beyond the context, is not going to be preferred, even if it's more likely. So in um, the Lovely and Likely paper, we give a couple examples of from the early history of the auto industry. And there's a historian, James Flink, very famous historian, who was describing the early history of the auto industry, and all he cared about was getting the story right. All he wanted was likely. He had no that was all the loveliness in effect he needed, was just to be very right, very accurate, very detailed, and to kind of fill in the blanks of a pretty important story that had not previously been told using lots of interesting sources. It was, the um, the veil protests in Uzbekistan in 1927. He wanted to understand what was happening, what happened there. Subsequently, other scholars, Huggy Rao, my co-authors, used Flink's account to generate a, a, a more lovely, from a management researcher's perspective, description of the early auto races and what did they mean from a sort of certification perspective, and how was the industry structure being reflected in the types of choices that racers were making in the cars they were driving, and kind of brought a whole bunch of other theory to bear on it. But that was what was lovely to them. That was their uh, and there was some debates, and there was a replication, and these data didn't say what they thought they said, and so again, that's what we do. We dig in, and so I think that the short answer is, it depends on your personal judgments, the thing you are looking to explain, and it also depends on uh, the what other explanations you're able to unearth. So if you only have one explanation, it's going to be the loveliest and the likeliest you have. If you work hard and generate real and sort of plausible alternatives, then you have a choice to make. Then you can test for yourself. Where does this explanation fit? Where does it strike me? Uh, we've tried to avoid the idea of trading off. Oh, if we get a little more lovely, we can really, we'll lose some likely, but that's one thing I don't like about this slide, is it makes it look like, oh, well, there's just an algorithm, and we maximize lovely and likely, and that's the one we choose. I think the choice is actually really much more of a composite assessment of all the explanations we see. And if we think about kind of the history of the theory of abduction, it's something we know from we just come to it. We sort of open our eyes and we say, that's it. That's my preferred explanation. So I think for sure, don't expect to publish something that's highly speculative, but sounds really interesting, the foolish one. And neither should you expect to publish James Flink or Doug Winthrop's first story of what was happening on the ground. That's probably not going to be very um, interesting and do much general work for a management audience. But between those two extremes, it's very much a matter of the the authorial team's perception of what is the right kind of composite mix of lovely and likely.
Thank you, David.
Yeah. So anyway, I hope that's because it's a very reasonable question. Like, oh, do we just like sort of go along some frontier, trade off this much lovely for a little more likely? And I think we're trying to avoid that way of, or at least in my view, we don't want to see it as just a kind of trade-off, but really more as a composite judgment that the researcher makes. Thank you. I see a few other questions. Yeah, I see Ravi. Yeah, so as scholars, we don't want to be myth makers. So I think that's and we have some that actually, if you look at the Lovely and Likely paper, the story that the anecdote that we start with is a paper that has 10,000 citations in Google Scholar, but reports on things that it just doesn't make any sense. Its explanations are basically foolish. But it was so lovely that it's got 10,000 sites. And the papers that report updated the that explanation just have a few hundred sites, a decade later. We know it's a myth, but it's a useful myth. Yeah, so Kevin, that's actually my answer to your question is sometimes a myth is so lovely, it just does work for us. I mean, that's what actually the Greek myths do by definition, is they fill our kind of cultural repertoire of the way uh, stories people act. So they don't need to be likely at all. Okay, I'll move ahead a little bit. I don't have that much more actually to formally present. Yeah, so in the Lovely and Likely paper, we bring forward these three historical methods: contextualization, hermeneutics, and source criticism. Again, my historian colleagues may want to add some other methods there. We've tried to kind of do a little bit of abstracting and essentializing by saying these are sort of the three critical historical methods for management research. And we combine them, and our claim is overall that we're improving verisimilitude or sort of our ability to get closer to what happened. We're never sure we get truth. Truth is capital T out there on the other side of the horizon. But we get closer to truth by facilitating judgment needed to balance these virtues, these explanatory virtues, which are themselves incommensurable. We don't want to we can't really weigh consilience and coherence or parsimony, and they're all important. We just choose the thing that we think helps us the most. Yeah, and if you want to read more about Lovely and Likely, we do have this nice paper that we produced about that. I have one more example, but I actually think I may just uh, jump through it because I think that for folks with a historical bent, and I'm assuming most of our participants here today are really interested in how we use history. I think the Watson story is probably the better example. So I'm just going to buzz through that. I'll just sort of summarize. We have this kind of PEBI framework, and we're trying not to template it, but everyone who comes to us asks, uh, what's the template? So we're writing this. This is a paper that's now under review. Again, if you email me, I'll put you on the list to get the revised version. So yeah, just back to a little bit to it brought to your question about this. It's a holistic assessment. So we try not to make these trade-offs. Historical methods can help. So here we have our, contextualization, hermeneutics, and source criticism, but historical methods are not a panacea. We can still make all kinds of mistakes. History isn't going to save us from being wrong. And we should not run away from statistical analysis. So if I go back to one of those original questions about kind of where historical methods fit into our existing set of toolkits, I don't like putting history in as only a qualitative method. History is also part of quantitative methods, and importantly so. And when I look at the Handbook of Strategic Management on my bookshelf behind me, and they have latest on qualitative methods, latest on quantitative methods, and historical methods are nowhere, I realize we still have some work to do. And finally, I just say, beware the shield of abduction. So this is my colleague Dave Wagisback's idea. We were sitting at lunch, and he said, wow, that abduction stuff is really taking over the Academy of Management. Every time anyone asked a hard question about method, the author would just say, it's an abductive study. And so he said, and he raised his hand like this and said, it's the shield of abduction. So I said, wow, I need, AI to make me a shield of abduction. So it did. And I think we need to be wary not to use abduction as an excuse for our inability or unwillingness or whatever um, to find a better method sometimes. There's some myths of abduction. The idea that abduction lies between deduction and induction is kind of we can actually ask Anders to speak about this in some in the Q&A, but the idea is abduction is orthogonal to both, and I'll let Anders. I don't want to steal Anders' thunder on this. This is his story, but we shouldn't think of them in this linear way. Or there's this. Sometimes people say, "Oh, it can't be abduction if you have theoretical priors," and I think that's also a myth, because we all have everything we look at comes through the lens of theory. We bring theory to every observation. This is, very basic to the philosophy of science. Theory and observation can never be separated in the human mind. So we always bring theoretical priors. We can have theoretical puzzles as well as empirical puzzles. So we don't need to kind of pretend that we have no starting point for our work. Of course, we stand on the shoulders of giants. The idea that abduction does not let you do predictive tests, of course we can. They're just not meant to be predictive of the world. They're only operating in a particular context. So we're trying to understand that all our explanations focus on the context that we're trying to explain. And then we try and understand, well, can we use other levers of analysis to extend that analysis, that explanation rather, to other contexts? And then finally, this idea that there's one best explanation. Many times, our best explanation may be a kind of amalgam of two potential explanations, because maybe we can't decide between them. they're equally compelling, or they're both very interesting, or they each have, we can't ignore one or the other. So we have to kind of bring them together, and that best explanation is then contingent on future work, on learning more, on bringing in knowledge from other domains and disciplines. So this is just the final piece of this, and the idea here is actually really important for all of us as knowledge producers, all of us as editors. And that is that our knowledge claims, the abductive knowledge claims, will look different. They come, we have to always bear in mind that the knowledge is being generated from a particular context. If we're very lucky, we reach to theory, but it's a provisional and contested claim to theory. We can't say that because of this explanation in this context, we know how this phenomenon operates everywhere. So the example we have here is from this Hansen and Liebkep. It's a beautiful study in JPE, now a couple, decades old, but it's an explanation of the Dust Bowl in the United States in the 1920s. That's what it explains. And then we can say, oh, well, how does this explanation generalize? What is it? Where else might we see similar phenomena? What are the kind of theoretical levers that are working in this case? And we have to actively work to move that finding, that explanation, from the context in which it was generated to other contexts. We can't just say, because of this unreliable test statistic, the theory is confirmed and therefore is universal. And that's very hard. It places an added burden on the reader, because it means we can't just harvest theory from a published study, and it places enormous burden on the judgment of the editor, who has to evaluate the claim and decide, is this generalizable enough? Is this lovely and likely enough to share with to add it to the canon to become part of our general set of knowledge? So this is, where things I think really get sticky, and where we're going to have to, over the next decade or so, really figure out how we evaluate knowledge claims from abductive work. Okay, so I think, let me just look at my notes. I think that's, yeah, so I just, where do I come back to the big questions we started with? I think we've worked through a little something on each of these. Hopefully this is useful for you. And my updated advice. So this is an old slide, but I'm very much updating it these days with I think I've added a third shaker of salt. I used to just have one. So I used to say that historical method should be your method of last resort, because it is so time intensive, and because it's so uncertain about what you will find and how you will apply it to contexts that the rest of the field of management can understand and appreciate and value. And I've sort of updated that to say, well, now I recommend you turn to history when our existing explanations are unsatisfying to you. So if you have a legitimate puzzle, a theoretical puzzle, an empirical puzzle, something you can't explain, you may have to turn to history. And again, take it with a grain of salt. I don't know that that's necessarily the right thing to do. You're going to have to understand context. You're going to have to read the literature. Doing abduction may require mastering 3 or 4 literatures that are all potentially relevant and potentially generating explanations in in the context you choose to study. And you may have to then recognize the boundaries of your explanation in ways that are very humbling. But if you can't explain something, you've got a problem. History may be able to help. So I'll close with, again, this sort of the plea for humble claims. It really is the way forward. I hope, to the extent that we all can, you know, I'm it's with some humility that I make this plea and recognize how audacious it is. But I think if this is something we can agree to together, then actually we can scope the field, scope our knowledge claims, have a much more productive set of conversations going forward about which explanations apply where, what qualifies as theory, and maybe get ourselves a little bit out of the theory thicket that I feel like we've been stuck in for much of the last few decades. Finally, and this I promise is the last slide. If you are or have a student who needs more about abduction, my colleagues and I, so listed here, Rashri, Brent, Sojin, Makamoeen, Sandeep, Audra Wormald, taught an online course on abductive methods in the spring of 24, this past spring. We'll be teaching it again in the spring of 26, but I think this QR code will also take you to a version of the syllabus from that course, if that's useful. And if people would like, we had students from 10 or 12 different universities enroll in that class last spring, and we haven't quite figured out how big it can get, but we would be very happy to notify people who are interested, so either you or your potentially students could enroll. And that will be 2 years from now. It's on every other year cycle. Okay, thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, maybe we can open up now for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please, if you could raise your virtual hand so we can see you and call you.
Yeah, apologies. I'm just catching up to the chat because I think I lost a few things.
Alicia?
Hi, Everett. Hi, David. Thanks so much for the chat. How are you guys doing?
Great.
Cool. I did post in the chat, but I just wanted to reiterate my question. David, this is more on the pragmatic sort of analysis side of research, but I'm kind of blending primary data collection, so where I have interviewees that I've talked about, but obviously asking them to look back retrospectively over like a 10-year period, which is always challenging. And then I'm supplementing that with extensive archival data. So social media, news media, anything and everything about the topic that I'm talking about. And I wanted to ask your perspective on, does that add unnecessary complexity to analysis where you're kind of trying to position people's current stance and perspective when they're trying to position themselves backwards in time, and then line that up with archival data that, has a slightly different perspective or like view, rather, of what was happening at a given point in time. Is that unnecessary complicating of my analysis is the question.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I think maybe some others actually have some thoughts on it who might like to weigh in. But I think, the person whose work I really enjoyed a little bit in this spirit is Arun Ranganathan from Berkeley, who has done this sort of full cycle methodology where she's been studying singers in I forget it's a really cool type of Indian music, and then how music is made, and where she's been doing a lot of interviewing and also a bunch of archival work. And so,
Mhm.
I think the idea is, if the full cycle methodology, if bringing in all the other sources is helps strengthen your explanation of what you are observing, then you
Yeah.
do it.
Mm.
Uh, but if you have a really nicely, again, I'm not an expert in qualitative methods,
Mhm.
of traditional qualitative methods, but if my understanding is, if you have a well formulated and well conceived qualitative study that generates insights without all that other contextual noise, then
Mhm.
you can proceed as you were.
Yeah.
But I think what tends to happen, and again, you look like a youngish person, so I'm assuming this might be something that is where you are still acquiring the contextual knowledge that you need to understand what you've observed.
Mm.
It's not something where you're already an expert in it. You didn't found the company and grow it and then go back and, like,
Mhm.
interview your employees and ask them, how did you understand what I told you to do? Right.
Right.
Right. This
Right.
is you kind of learning. So in that context, it's quite reasonable to think you might need more information to make sense of what you've done. And then
Right.
the thing not to do is to pretend you didn't do that research.
Right.
Right. It's like,
Right.
oh, I gained my competence as a witness. I can testify on behalf of these actors because of my both sincerity and my competence. And
Right.
the competence came from the maybe some contextual knowledge. The sincerity came from my engagement with these individuals as
Right.
actors, as agentic humans, as
Mhm.
people with voice who we need to hear from. So I
Okay.
think that's you know, if you really, if you have 100% confidence in your sort of qualitative research design, Miles and
Yeah.
Huberman says, check, then just, skip it.
Go.
Um,
Yeah.
but I think in
If it's
most
adding
cases,
value.
like one of the papers I often recommend to students, I'm blanking on exactly which one, but I have it in my office, not at home. Stina Grodal, one of her
Yeah.
nanotech papers,
Mm.
has a beautiful a table in it of all the sources that she um, referenced to learn about nanotech. And
Mhm.
it's not because, you know, um, and Stina at that time was a graduate student. She was
Right.
learning about what nanotech was. So
Mm.
she couldn't just say, "Oh, I know what I need to know."
Ad
She
lib.
had to go do that. So
Yeah.
this is someone now, of course, now who's very established senior scholar, but everyone starts from somewhere.
Right. Thank you.
Other questions or comments?
While we're waiting for people to raise their hand, there's a question in the chat from Jaleh about quantitative methods. Can we treat all secondhand quantitative data as historical data?
It's a great question. Not only can we must. Every all data all data are by definition historical. So the question is, so what? What do we do with that? Well, then we have to engage in some source criticism and ask, perhaps as someone like, Steph Decker would ask, well, what data are missing from this data set? Or why were these data collected and some other data not collected? Uh, if we were to conduct an ideal experiment, what data would we wish we had? How close do these data map to that ideal data set? Those are, again, these are questions that a good empirical researcher always asks, but hopefully historical methods, again, from this cross-cutting view that I talked about at the outset, historical methodology and the way historians interrogate sources may actually be helpful to us so that we don't kind of overweight the kind of truthfulness of a quantitative data set just because it's quantitative. I hope, Jaile, I hope that answers the question. I see, let's see, someone has their hand raised. Please.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Benny Yelme?
Yes, I have my hand raised. I use the virtual as well as my
yeah, I see a real hand and a virtual hand.
That's okay. Thanks so much, David. You began by saying that we should move away from, or we are over the historic turn. At the end of the presentation, where do we stand? And I asked that question because it looks like there are some context where the historical turn is kind of new to them and for justifiable reasons. And that is because in this age of decolonization of management epistemology, history still matters to those contexts and those scholars. So at the end of the talk, are you still standing with moving away from that? And for those scholars, what would you say?
Sure. So it's a great question. And what I mean by moving past the historic turn is actually moving into a new phase where we naturalize the historical methods and context sensitivity, and actually are then able to center exactly the kinds of concerns you're raising. So we say, aha, so so for sure we need to the way that management knowledge has diffused or been pushed into non-Western regions, that is absolutely a historical question. But my point is we don't need to call it a historic turn. Now it's just management research. Let's do that research and center it exactly as you say. We don't have to justify it by saying, oh, now we're doing history, something exotic and different and new. No, now the work that we're doing is right in the center of the field. Not everyone. We're not going to turn all 13,000 members of the Academy of Management or EGOS or whatever into historians. That would be silly. But we hopefully have naturalized these modes of knowledge production and are seeing the way that this mode of knowledge production actually is imposing constraints on that older, hear my theories, they're universal, take them, they go everywhere, from wherever you are to wherever I made them up, and replacing that with a more nuanced, context-sensitive, historically informed mode of knowledge production. But we don't have to call it the historic turn anymore. Let's figure out what this new thing is that is actually using the tools that we've now imported.
Thank you.
David, I have a question about historical methods, perhaps a more basic question. Assuming, for those of us who are completely new, coming fresh into this idea of historical methods, what would you describe to be historical methods? And what would you say, perhaps on your experience, when people allude to doing historical methods, but actually it's not really historical methods? That's my first question. And the second one, what would you say are the advantages of using historical methods and disadvantages of using historical methods as an organizational scholar?
Sure. So hang on, I'm looking around because there's a book I'm going to literally knock over a stack of books in my office to get to it. So Here, I'll turn on my self view so I can. So I hope people could see this. This to me is the starting point. So it's called the Princeton Guide to Historical Research. I will maybe we can also put it into the notes that accompany. So it's written by a very fine historian named Zach Schrag, and it's really is just a kind of a how-to manual for historical research. So I don't recommend that any management researcher do what Zach says you should do, but you can read it to understand how historians approach problems, how they think about sources, how they think about questions, how they think about archives. It's really a fine piece of work. Zach is someone I think I put him on my unindicted co-conspirators list, if not yet another one I left off. But again, someone who's really trying to help us, because there aren't good, to your question, Ebert, they're not great resources for sort of how to do history. Historians in history graduate programs don't take methods classes in the way that we do in management. And so therefore there are fewer resources of that sort. But the Princeton Guide is really, to me, very helpful and a nice starting point. And to kind of pluses and minuses, I think, what the first thing I would say is there are pluses and minuses. So just be very, you need to be very clear-eyed about that, and that, history is not, as I said, I think in the talk, is not a panacea. Our historical methods aren't going to solve all the problem of inference and the overlapping knowledge domains and the overproduction of bad science and all this other stuff. What I think it can help us do is be a little bit more humble about what we know. This is what we know. But that's me in a certain phase of my career saying humble is good. A lot of other people may say, I don't want to be humble. I want to be, I want to discover big things. And maybe history is not the best tool for that person. So I think, the first thing is to recognize the trade-offs. And I would argue those trade-offs come with all methods, even our, RCT doing economists who, think that they've found the golden hammer are still, just looking for nails. I think, that one of the questions that I think Zach Schrag asks in the Princeton Guide is, what do you care about? What is the thing that's actually important to you? Your research question has to follow from something that is actually, if it's not interesting to you, it certainly won't be interesting to anybody else. And if it is interesting to you, then maybe a little history will also be interesting to you.
Thank you, David. Polly?
So David, thank you so much for your talk. And I was sort of thinking in terms of process, as you shared the PEBI model.
Mm-hmm.
Is it okay? Like, I'm working on a project right now that I think is a sort of using research.
Mm-hmm.
So if you begin your research with just the puzzle, but you only have maybe one explanation. Right now, I have one explanation.
Mm-hmm.
So is it okay that you discover these explanations as you are doing your research, or is that considered more or less rigorous? And I'm sort of comparing that to pre-certification of hypotheses. Like, should you have some explanations already, or?
No, I think you always have a kind of a preferred explanation, and the hard part is actually be convincing yourself of the plausibility of other explanations. So it's a great question, and for sure the explanations come from everywhere. In fact, I don't have it. I can't access it right now, but we have a whole section of the the Pebby paper that says explanations can come from anywhere. We want to, it might come from uh, the barista when you're getting your morning coffee and you are kind of in casual conversation and all of a sudden something, they say something and you're like, that's it. Or it could come from a seminar, or it could come from other readings, or it could come from reviewers who challenge your account. So the whole idea is that we need to generate the most robust possible list of explanations and still recognize that there's always a potential bad lot problem, which is that the best explanation is not in our lot. We didn't get the right set of explanations to consider. So that is the task, in fact, of I think doing this kind of work is to always be a little bit open to the idea that someone, a better explanation might just fly in the window on the wings of a little bird. Wouldn't that be amazing?
Thank you. Thank you. That's great.
Alanud?
You're on mute.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying thank you. So I just have a question. I'm new to the historical methods, and for my PhD, I'm studying the identity construction of philanthropists in US higher education. So by looking at fundraising, and I was thinking, I do believe that looking at it historically would be really valuable. I just don't know how to approach that because there are so many ways that you could approach it from like an organizational perspective, historically US higher education, and also from individual philanthropist perspective. So I was just wondering if there's anything you can tell me.
Well, first, thank you for doing this work. It sounds very interesting and important. And the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and the Ford, they did it all way back when. So how are the tech bros doing it differently? And what is, what kind of power are they exerting over the mode of knowledge production? And, I have to tiptoe around the Koch brothers and things like that. So yeah, it's a really interesting problem. I think I would focus on your puzzle. What's the thing that's puzzling to you? What's the thing that you're trying to explain? And then that will help you find, oh, well, actually, I do need to read what happened to the 19th century robber barons and how they legitimized their fortune and purchased status with
So
the
my puzzle would be
whatever it is.
Yeah. My puzzle would be looking at the role of fundraisers, professional fundraisers, in this identity construction, because yes, there's a lot of critical pieces on philanthropists, and when it comes to philanthropists, there's two meta narratives: the narratives of altruism and the narratives of, oh, they're evil and all that. But my puzzle is definitely would be looking at the role of fundraisers and all that. So I could look at it, the historical of fundraising as a profession, right? Or
so I think there's interesting organizational questions about how these roles get legitimized, and what how people are trained, and the rise of private wealth management, and also so I think again, focus on your question, and I don't want to take too much time here in this setting, but if you want to reach out, I'm happy to kind of brainstorm a little bit with you. But I think the idea is really, in general, we want to what are all the possible explanations for the thing we're observing? And again, like a little bit like that, the Tom Watson example, some of these explanations are super simple, but they're obviously foolish, so it can't just be that these are a bunch of greedy people trying to, blah, blah, blah. There has to, it has to be more
something
complicated
more.
than that. Oh, well, it can't just be, this is, good intention. They have to have some other motives as well. So then what are those in between explanations, and what's lovely, what's likely, how do we understand the emergence of this cadre of people who are acting in this way in our organizations? Who could I interview who understand this? Anyway, I just think that's where all of a sudden it gets much richer and more interesting.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Kevin?
Hi, David. First, thanks for a great session so far. So I go up for tenure next year, and my background is in quantitative methods, but I'm very interested in historical methods, applying that to entrepreneurship. And so I've been looking for various research kind of primers and tutorials or books on how to kind of start to get these skills. So I was curious if you have are there any seminal papers, like if you were going to teach a seminar in historical methods, or are there seminal papers you would have the students read that you could recommend?
Well, I think it's a reasonable question, and I'm going to have to point to some of my friends on this one. I think, Dan Wadwani and Andy Hargadon have a very nice AMR paper last year on microhistory. Maybe it was 2 years ago now. Time is flying, but it's a really a nice kind of argument for why a very particular kind of historical account can generate novel insights. So I think that's very helpful. I think it's in the reading list for this seminar. There's a quite a new handbook from Edward Elgar that Stephanie Decker co-edited, that has a lot of nice, very nice chapters on how to use archives and digital sources and all sorts of stuff. So I think that's a very good general resource. And then I think it is worth taking a look at Zach Schrag's sort of very, like, that's the historian's view of it. And so as you read that, you'll say, oh, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. I'm not that kind of historian. And then you'll say, okay, now, but I understand why they do it that way, and why the kind of explanation I want to generate is a little different than what they're doing. And I'm happy to, if people want to just reach out, I'm happy to send these references as I'm able.
Thank you.
And good luck.